From vaudeville to the silver screen to the small screen, the Marx Brothers made an impact wherever people found them. Now, Tom Fox and Mike Volkov bring them into the boardroom to help explain and explore the sometimes chaotic world of governance, risk management, ethics, and compliance. This is Why a Duck? Into the Compliance Soup, which is part of the Compliance Podcast Network.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of Why a Duck. In this episode, we continue our exploration of 2019, the year in review. Today, we look at top SEC and DOJ enforcement issues and data mine those for the compliance practitioner going forward. We also take a look at some of our favorite scenes from the great Marx Brothers movie, A Night at the Opera. I know you'll enjoy this episode. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back with Mike Volkov again for another episode of Why a Duck. We are in part two of a three-part exploration of 2019 on a look back and 2020 on a look forward, all in the context of A Night at the Opera, one of our favorite Marx Brothers movies, although, as I said, they're all our favorites. So, Mike, first of all, welcome back.
Thanks, Tom. Glad to be back. So,
Mike, it's hard to say what's your favorite scene or what's my favorite scene or what's the greatest scene, because they're all great. But this movie truly has one of the greatest scenes, and that's the stateroom scene. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Well, let's set the stage a little bit. Otis B. Driftwood, Groucho, is a business manager for our favorite Margaret Dumont character, Mrs. Claypool, who is going to invest money into the opera. And then they meet Herman Gottlieb, who is also in Day at the Races, the same actor, Sig Ruman, who is the director of the New York Opera Company. So there becomes a sort of triangle relationship between Margaret Dumont, Sig Ruman, Herman Gottlieb, Mrs. Claypool, and, of course, Otis B. Driftwood. I always loved Groucho's names. In any event, so there's a little bit of rivalry, and they're all going on a ship, to bring the opera to New York. And what happens is Mr. Driftwood and the New York Opera Company arrange for a room Mr. Gottlieb and the opera company arranged for a room for Mr. Driftwood, which is a Groucho. Of course, when he gets to his room on the ship, it's quite a small room. And it was, he walks into his room and he can barely fit his storage locker or his luggage into the room itself. And then he comes to find out that guess who snuck onto through his baggage there. Out pops Fiorella, as well as Tommaso. Tommaso is Harpo. Fiorello is Chico, and then they bring in their young, vibrant new singer who's in love with one of the singers on the opera company. And so the three of them sneak on to there, and all of a sudden in this little stateroom, he has four people. And then right after that is when the fun starts to happen. Fiorello, Chico, says, we got to get food or we don't go. And so Driftwood goes out to get a steward to order some food, and he says, I say, Stu, where are you? And he starts to order dinner for all the people in his room, and he obviously starts to order lots of food to make sure that everybody has some. And he orders and two medium boiled eggs. Fiorello from inside the room screams out, and two hard-boiled eggs. And then he says, and two hard-boiled eggs. Tommaso then honks his horn, that's Harpo, and then Driftwood goes, make that three hard-boiled eggs. So nonetheless, it keeps going like that. And then at the very end of the order, he orders some more eggs, and then Harpo goes and basically squeezes the horn 10 times. And he says, and Groucho says, either it's foggy outside or we need 10 more hard-boiled eggs. In any event, so as this happens and they're waiting for the food to come, all of a sudden a parade of people start coming in, asking to either use the cabin or perform their regular duties. So all of a sudden, there are four people in there. Two cleaning ladies come in to make up the bed, a manicurist, a ship's engineer, a sort of tubby guy with a wrench, and his fat assistant, a girl passenger looking for her aunt, a maid who says, I came to mop up. And Groucho says, well, you'll have to start on the ceiling. And then 4 waiters with trays of food. And this was where then Groucho says, is it my imagination or is it getting crowded in here? And then eventually Mrs. Claypool comes to, that's Margaret Dumont, comes to open the door. And when she opens the door, everybody tumbles out. One of the classic scenes of all time. And throughout this, Harpo is asleep, basically groggy and just falling all over people. And just his body is just going all over everybody. So it's a classic scene, one that it's worth just watching on YouTube if you can pull it up. It just is. It makes you laugh like you've never laughed before.
A couple of things I would just like to add. It's just hilarious, and the sarcasm and wit of Groucho comes through as more and more people come in. And it looks like to me they speeded up the film when people fell out, but they're just like tumbling cards coming out. And I don't know how they were able to accomplish that without tying people together and bringing them down. A couple of things I would just wanted to add is that when the Marx Brothers went over to MGM, they started going out on vaudeville shows and testing some of these skits out. So they would go to local arenas outside of the Los Angeles area and do these skits to see what worked, what didn't. And literally they were timed down with stopwatches to the second. So that's one of the reasons the timing was so great. The other thing I found was that silent comedy great Buster Keaton actually helped write many of these skits. He's uncredited in these movies, but I've often wondered what Keaton's comedic sense of timing what he brought to the Marx Brothers, because he was a little bit older than them. They came up through vaudeville. He had done that since he was a child, but he was a silent movie star before they got into the movies. So lots of resources that MGM brought to bear. But Mike's absolutely right. Get on YouTube. In fact, I'll try to see if I can find that stateroom scene and put it on our show notes because it's so funny.
Absolutely.
Mike, today I thought we would take a look at, or I wanted to maybe build on what you talked about in our last podcast. And in this podcast, I wanted to tick off some of the specific FCPA cases and then get your thoughts on some of the interesting points, or points that at least I thought were interesting. I wanted to start with the Department of Justice with Fresenius. Fresenius was a long-standing FCPA investigation, and the company did not qualify for a declination. The facts were very well laid out and with lots of different bribery schemes. But I guess the thing that struck me, the company secured an NPA, but it also got a monitorship for 2 years, followed by an additional year of self-reporting. So the monitorship is not dead. Companies, even though Brian Spankowski, both in the Spankowski memo and leading to the evaluation of corporate compliance programs, has really laid out what a company has to do to avoid a monitorship. Yet we saw a targeted monitorship with Fresenius, and we saw that again actually in the Walmart case as well. So perhaps a little bit different uses of monitors going forward.
We had, let's say, 3 monitorships this year. One in Fresenius, one in MTS Telesystems, actually, wait a minute, I'm thinking 4. We had Walmart, which is surprising to me, and Ericsson, I believe, as well. So I was surprised by the Walmart one, which we'll talk about later. But Fresenius is an interesting case because it was pretty pervasive in terms of the bribery scheme running into 17 countries. With it's the largest dialysis provider in the world. And for them to sort of run into, they interact all the time with government officials. And it's obviously a big business for obvious reasons with kidney health involved. But so it's pretty pervasive. They came out with the NPA, which I thought was interesting for them. They didn't have to plead guilty, have a subsidiary plead guilty or anything like that. So they got a lot of credit, I thought, for the for their cooperation and their remediation. But it just didn't. I think Fresenius, in the end, I know they were disappointed that they had to deal with a monitor for 2 years. But a lot of their conduct was pretty egregious, where they had basically the business was resisting any compliance and trying to circumvent compliance and not even responding to compliance demands for, let's say, information or things like that. It was that basic within the company.
So, Mike, next up was two of the cases you highlighted, MTS and Ericsson. Although they're both telecom companies, I thought they had a little bit different focus. MTS was one of three massive FCPA enforcement actions that came out of Uzbekistan, and the bribery of the former daughter of the former president, Gulnara Karimova. We had Vion and we had Telia in these trilogy of cases that came in at over $2.5 billion for the settlement of the three. And I guess the thing that I would just like to highlight from MTS, in addition to the fact it was a telecom, is regime change, democratic regime change. I don't mean Saddam Hussein regime change. I mean, when you have a regime change, we are seeing more and more that the new guys are prosecuting the old guys for corruption. And this is turning against many companies who may have done business with the old guys. So as a compliance practitioner, you typically don't really focus on the political risks as much, but now you may need to talk to your political risk specialist in your company, or if you don't have one, take advantage of some of the services that do so. And then Ericsson. Ericsson was really not a part of the Uzbekistan imbroglio, but the company just had a stunning fine, but it was based on stunning conduct, literally across the globe, multiple bribery schemes. And here's the thing that was unsaid, but I thought was a highlight of the case, Mike. In the Telia case, the fine was split between the U.S. and Sweden, but it was contingent on the Swedes successfully prosecuting two of the C-suite officers involved in the bribery and corruption. The Swedish government was unable to get convictions of them, so they forfeited their share of the fine and penalty for Telia. Ericsson, the U.S. government did not share any of its fine and penalty with the Swedish government, although they did acknowledge assistance from the Swedish government in the enforcement action. So I've wondered, did that experience with the Swedes failing to successfully prosecute C-suite officers from Telia inform or influence that decision? The other thing was, once again, not said, but reading between the lines, it was pretty clear to me that this bribery schemes were, if not fully approved, tacitly approved at the highest levels of the company. And will there be any additional repercussions for that?
Well, you know what, Tom, that's a great point. I never noticed that about the Telia. I remember them, seeking the prosecution in Sweden of the officials. And I hope that DOJ will now try to bring those officials into the United States to prosecute them in future cases, not in that case, obviously. But that's a great point. I didn't notice that difference. I did notice that it was a pretty clean case in Ericsson, where they took $1 billion and they just put together the SEC money and the DOJ money. And we didn't have a situation where other law enforcement or countries were sharing in the proceeds. So I thought that's a great point. I have two observations from those cases. One is going back to the MTS Telesystems and the whole Uzbekistan series of cases. To me, one of the sort of glaring issues there is the use of shell companies and the failure to look behind the shell companies into the real beneficial owners. And even if they did, they sort of didn't want to know that really Karimova was the controlling party in interest and was also going to control the award of licenses and other cellular telephone requirements in Uzbekistan. So the shell companies and the failure of companies to conduct due diligence and then to document it. In Vimpelcom, it was just a tragedy of errors and just circumvention of any compliance regularity. that is depicted in that case. And the same thing happened here. And kudos to the department for finally indicting Kumar Vovra. And she also is the subject of the kleptocracy initiative, where they've been securing a lot of her assets all over the world. She's got them everywhere. The other point I wanted to make with regard to Ericsson and some of the other cases this year, but it's also highlighted particularly in Ericsson, is it's incredible to me that we're seeing cases now where conduct and schemes and systemic problems are going all the way up into 2016, 2017. And this kind of recent conduct to me highlights something that I just don't understand. With all the sort of global focus on compliance, anti-corruption enforcement, anti-corruption compliance, to have a global company just engaging in systemic type conduct that is tacitly, or I think actually deliberately pursued at the highest levels, to me sends a real message to the law enforcement and to compliance and to governance experts. What the heck is going on in these companies that allows them to engage in this conduct? I thought at some point with the movement that we're talking about, we would see fewer and fewer systemic cases that include conduct up into the recent years. Now, Ericsson was a 17-year stretch, but they never stopped the conduct prior to 2017, and that to me is just outrageous given the environment we're operating in.
Mike, next up, I would like to turn to Walmart. And if there was one case that was the most watched, the most waited for over the past multiple years, I think this one may have been it. The Walmart was extraordinarily public in what they were doing. As a public company, of course, they had to release figures on the amount of money they spent in pre-settlement investigation and remediation. And you can't have much more stunning figure in pre-settlement remediation and investigation than the $900 million plus that Walmart had. Walmart got a relatively low penalty of $282 million, and they are required to have a very focused and targeted monitor. And you spoke to quite well, I thought, on the surprise meeting the compliance community had about that. But the point that I really wanted to make from the Walmart case, and maybe get your thoughts on, is the commitment from senior management. And whatever Walmart may or may not have done in 2005, 2006, 2004 in Mexico, I guess that's pretty well documented what they did, how management at that time frame turned a blind eye to what was going on down there. They, in my mind, completely turned it around. And they brought in new senior leadership, not simply in compliance, but on the business level, business operations level. And they made a 100% commitment to cleaning up the mess and putting in place a best practices, if not gold standard compliance program. So for me, one of the key lessons from Walmart is that top management really can make a difference when they choose to do so. What were some of the thoughts you had on Walmart?
Well, one issue I just don't understand, and maybe we know the backstory. I don't know the backstory. Maybe you do, but there's got to be a backstory as to how Walmart can spend $900 million on remediation, implementing a lot of sort of state-of-the-art compliance program functions, and then notwithstanding all of that, notwithstanding their extraordinary remediation effort, they get a monitorship. Now, I think it was you who told me that the monitor is Louis Freeh, and to me, that I still don't understand how they of all companies could do that. There must be something that we don't know about in the story in terms of whether or not the testing was revealing weaknesses in the program. I raised that issue. Let me give you one more issue, Tom, and then turn it back to you. The other issue that I thought is somewhat funny, lawyers, I always say, are good at corruption. Comes with our territory. And the lawyers in Mexico who were engaging in this bribery scheme, one of my favorite facts is that they, in their billing for paying bribes locally to for real estate approvals and zoning approvals and things like that. They set up a coding system for their bills for the types of bribes they were paying. In other words, what was the purpose of the bribe? And only a lawyer could come up with, codes and whatnot for bribes and then submit them as legitimate bills and then get paid for them. So kudos to that. But again, just a reminder that lawyers and other professionals are not just clean by the fact that they're a professional. They need to be monitored and watched over just as much. We had even another case this past year. I think it was Quad Graphics, where they bribed a judge in a tax case down in Peru. And the lawyers did it. So watch out for lawyers, and Walmart is definitely a reminder on watch out for lawyers.
So, Mike, now I'd like to turn to some SEC cases. And in our prior podcast, you talked about sort of the split or dichotomy that seems to be now taking shape with the Department of Justice handling the kind of mega cases and the Securities and Exchange Commission coming in on fines and penalties that are significantly less. But the other thing that has really caught my eye is the detail in the SEC enforcement actions. It's typically a cease and desist order, and they really provide a lot of lessons learned for the compliance practitioner. So that's what really I'd like to highlight with a few cases. The first one was, let me just pick up on the one you just mentioned, Quad Graphics. And the lesson I got from Quad Graphics, it was a U.S. company who bought a Canadian company. And that Canadian company, in addition to giving them automatically an international component, that Canadian company had international operations that had not been the subject of M&A due diligence and had not been scrubbed by anyone. And there were multiple instances of bribery and corruption. And it really drove home the point when you expand, you have to look at who you're bringing on as an M&A target or candidate. And if you now go from a domestic company to an international company, you're going to have a huge FCPA compliance issue, which Quad Graphics really never was able to address. We had one of the famous princeling cases or hiring cases that came out of continuing to come out of banks in the Far East, and that was Barclays. And Mike, the thing that struck me about the Barclays case was really the basic nature of the compliance function at Barclays. Had no idea that hiring a son and daughter of someone, a foreign government official who was going to send you business and then tracking that is an FCPA violation. And the SEC order went on to state APAC compliance officers stated they were unaware of this aspect of the policy. And one senior APAC compliance executive said he had never read the company's anti-bribery and corruption policy. Now, this was back in 2009, so hopefully those days are over, but it led me to think that sometimes you just have to go back to the basics and make sure your gatekeepers are trained and can articulate what the gates they are.
Let me just make one point on the SEC front, Tom. And I thought that there are definitely lessons learned. And I thought there were several cases here that really got into the micro relationship between your company and distributors. And there was Microsoft, for example. In other cases where rebates and discounts were not passed on to the customer ultimately, and these rebates and discounts were basically used as a means to fund bribery slush funds. And so the SEC is really giving us a lot of detailed information on this. And so to me, it means you really got to dig into your third-party relationships, monitor them, and identify any anomalies that you see, like these as highlighted in Microsoft and some other situations.
So my next case to look at from the SEC perspective was Westport Fuel System. Right. And here we had actual CEO involvement in the bribery scheme through control override. So you actually overrode the controls around purchasing or investing in and with a joint venture partner. She went further and lied to the board about this, and then actually changed the financial reporting. So we rarely have I would say, I hope we rarely have CEO involvement, but this was a case where we did have that. And the board, when they were made aware of it, did, I thought, appropriately respond. But a board has a role in FCPA compliance as well. And the board has to oversee the CEO. And while oversight does not mean management, it does occasionally mean testing. And you may have to test into the weeds as a board. We had two Delaware Supreme Court decisions in 2019 that really emphasized the role of the board in oversight of compliance. And I think boards are going to have to take a more active role on this issue going forward. What were your thoughts?
Absolutely. Two things. One is, the SEC in this case settled separately with the CEO. The CEO, I think, more than just participated in it, basically she orchestrated the whole thing. And so, interestingly, DOJ did not bring a case against her, at least at this point. But I thought the evidence was pretty strong against her, and she clearly manipulated the entire situation. The second point about board responsibility, look, we've got two great examples, I think. One was Cognizant and the way that they handled the matter when it came up in their case, in the DOJ case, where they, 2 weeks after learning about a potential bribery scheme, they disclosed it. And they didn't know the full nature of the scheme and how it was carried out. They were just at the beginning, but they took that risk. The two Delaware cases you mentioned, one in the pharma industry and one in the food industry, and I've written about those as well, are really significant because it's the first whittling away of the Caremark standard. And I think it raises the risks for board members. The only point I can say to kind of distinguish those two cases from this situation is, they involved regulated markets, meaning that, you're dealing with food safety and drug safety. And the court there seemed more willing to impose on the board when you're in a regulated market. But I think, look, there's greater focus on the boards these days. We're pushing the issue. You are pushing the issue with a lot of other thought leaders that the boards need to have a compliance professional on the board. And hopefully we'll get to that point. But it certainly seems to me like a minimum requirement that needs to be met as we head into the years of board risk.
So, Mike, in one last case that I think you're fairly well familiar with, but it also channels one of the phrases that I've heard you use literally for 10 years, and that's follow the money. And that's a Juniper Networks case. And really, for me, this case emphasized the need to follow the money of where it goes, not simply marketing dollars or charitable donations or things that are hidden in the books and records of a company. But if there are rebates given, how are those rebates paid? Are they paid to the address on the contract? Are they paid to a bank account that's listed in the contract? Is that, if it's paid offshore, do you have a second set of eyes on it saying, well, this is going to a bank in the Cayman Islands? Why is that when this, our counterparty, our customer, our distributor is in Ecuador or Peru or some other country? So I would really ask compliance practitioners to think about this case in terms of it's not your catchphrase. I don't think you could lay claim to it because follow the money's been with us since Watergate, which of course led to the FCPA. But follow the money is absolutely critical, and compliance practitioners need to find ways to track monies internally in their organization to see where they're going because you got to have a pot of money to pay a bribe somehow.
And that's right, Tom. And I think Juniper also highlights the really difficult issues in the tech sector where you have channel partners and layers of channel partners in terms of a distribution scheme where and this raises a real, difficult issues because sometimes the company itself is not in privity, does not have a contract with, a distributor way down the line or a reseller way down the line, and they have to sort of push down as much as they can in terms of compliance, representations, and certifications. So follow the money gets even more difficult as you sort of lose the ability to gain insight and transparency into some of the relationships down in a channel partner situation, particularly in the software and tech sectors.
So, Mike, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time, but I hope our listeners will join us again for our next episode, where we take a look into the veiled land of the future, orchestrated by Karnak the Magnificent, what 2020 may bring for the compliance practitioner. Mike, I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks, Tom.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I hope you enjoyed this part 2 of our 3-part exploration of A Night at the Opera and a look back at the year in enforcement 2019. Please join us next week, where we continue to look at some of our favorite scenes from A Night at the Opera and put on our Karnak the Magnificent hat to look at issues that we believe will be important in 2020. We look forward to visiting with you then.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Why a Duck. Make sure to subscribe, and if you enjoyed the episode, leave a review.